Well, good afternoon and welcome to this panel that will discuss metrics and algorithms in journalism. Very pleased that all of you have decided to join us on this glorious afternoon here in Perugia. There are many places you could be right now, out in the sun, enjoying a terrace, and we're very glad that you decided to join us here for what I hope will be a productive and stimulating discussion. This will be it's a group of academics, but we're friendly academics, and we're academics who are very keen to discuss practice and real-world things and case studies. And so I encourage you to ask any of the panelists questions about things very close to the ground, close to your organizations, things that affect the way you produce and distribute the news. What I'll do, my name is Colin Egger, I'll be the chair for this. I'll introduce each of the colleagues, and then I will hand things over to Valerie, who will get us started. To my immediate right is Seth Lewis, who is a professor of journalism at Oregon State University. Next is Pierluigi Perri, who is a professor of law at the University of Milan, and who is at the moment in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe. And at the far side is Valerie Belair-Gagnon, who is a professor of journalism studies at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. So with that, I will pass things over to Valerie, who will begin by talking about measuring success with metrics.
So welcome. Thank you so much for inviting us here again in Perugia. So today what I will talk about more specifically is how the relationship between journalists and web metrics companies and how they're dealing with issues of transparency. But before I start, I want to give a little bit of information about myself. So why am I studying metrics, where I come from? I'm a media sociologist, and my interest of studies is how new technologies is changing the culture of journalism. I studied how social media has changed journalism in some case studies, like the BBC. With Colin, we've done some work on mobile chat applications, and now my new project is on metrics. So how many of you here use metrics in newsrooms? Okay. Are you an editor, or what's your role? Yeah.
No, I'm rather a strategist.
So you use metrics on a daily basis?
Not on a daily basis. For me, it's rather doing strategies for editors and tell them what could be a relevant path to follow to increase their audience. And I'm also using it for search engine optimization purposes, which is not even on a daily basis, but where your audience comes from and where it goes to. That's what my focus.
That's interesting. So I should talk to you after that. So and just another example, how do you use metrics?
So I've used metrics both as an editor in a newsroom to see what stories are performing the best in terms of traffic and give feedback to reporters on what practices work best and which stories performed well and why we think that might be. I've also worked in content marketing at a big corporation and used metrics there to see, again, what articles are performing well and why, and also as part of a search engine optimization strategy.
And do you find there differences between the journalism and the strategic communication field?
I find that there's a much stronger appetite for the use of metrics within the content marketing realm than in journalism.
Okay, interesting. So there's a few, and who has never used metrics or thought about it ever? Don't be shy. I was there once. Okay, so I'll kind of go over, so thank you for your comments. I'll go over some of kind of the basics of metrics, right? So sorry for the people who actually use it on an everyday basis in their newsroom. Oh, right. So again, there are like different types of metrics in newsroom. We have audience metrics, so you can look at how many visitors come to your page views, how many people, how much time people spend on your page, how do they scroll down your page. There are also information that you can get on the audience, so you can get location where the audience comes from or some information about demographics. So you can kind of like even like point down to the city level where in the city the person is watching or reading your news online. And There are also kind of audience metric that you can get on different devices, so that will vary on mobile, on the web, etc. And also, I mentioned there's like, you can measure content, right? So how many % of people exit your page, and when do they decide to exit your page? So all of this is very interesting because we have a lot of data, and what we're asking ourselves right now is what do we do with that data, and what does it mean for journalism? So scholars, lots of friendly scholars studying this in newsrooms, including, I think Seth has studies at also metrics. Lots of what scholars have found out is that most of the people are using metrics to inform their decision making. So when do they choose? Oh, yeah, I'm just managing two computers. So what kind of decisions they can make in the newsroom? So where they would put the story and that will get more clicks, for example. Another thing is metrics is allowing journalists to finally kind of have an idea of what their audience is, right? When we're talking about metrics, for example, to know where people come from. So now we finally know where people come from when they read their news. It's also a way for engaging with audience. This is like a little bit of a buzzword in a sense that, you know, like engagement, not in terms of the audience being completely engaged in the information that you're providing, but maybe more in terms of time spent reading an article or amount of people reading an article online. And there are challenges, right? Because at the same time that you see an increasing amount of people using metrics in newsroom, there's what scholars have found out is that a lot of journalists tends to be a little bit more dismissive. So because it kind of is a challenge between how do I keep my autonomy as a news producer, but how do I also take into account what the audience likes? So here's a few examples of how news organizations have used metrics. So NPR has been using metrics, a metric tool called CareBot, which is open source. Not everybody is showing what they're doing behind the scenes. Then Gawker has done some things called branded traffic. And one of the kind of main trend that we found is that now people are looking at conversion. Right? How do I make sure that people come back, and how do the amount of time that people come back on my pages influences the amount of people that are going to subscribe to my news organization? And this is a little bit of an area where it's very difficult to find how many people will end up subscribing to your news feed. So here's a bunch of academics. I know I have to wave the flag of a bunch of academics who have studied metrics and what they found, right? So this idea of tension between autonomy, right? How do I generate traffic, but I remain autonomous with my news judgment, so that I don't necessarily do what I don't necessarily just do what the audience wants, right? Originally, what people like Caitlin Petrie has found was that it was kind of exciting because finally we can know what the audience thinks, but at the same time, metrics create a lot of anxiety in newsroom for journalists. But in my very early stage research so I just started a new project, I found that this anxiety is kind of diminishing because now it seems that there's kind of an institutionalization that is happening in a lot of newsrooms. So what I find really interesting about this world of web analytics is that most of the companies that are working with journalists are actually outside companies that are not necessarily created by journalists or by newsroom. So journalists have to constantly negotiate this relationship with these external companies that have like a different mentality than news producers. And this is just an example of, so I spoke to a few people at different organizations, including Parsley, and this is an example of what the dashboards would look like for those who have never seen a metrics dashboard. Oh, yeah. So, okay, it's better here. But okay, so this is what I found. So one of the major trends that I found in the newsroom is this challenge of transparency with metrics, web analytics and metrics. So one of the kind of trend that is happening right now is a lot of metrics company are starting to kind of figure out, are starting to be more transparent about their own data, right? So where the data comes from, that's a question, because we can do something with the data, but we don't really know where the data comes from. When was it collected? That's another question. How was it collected? And also, and how was it collected comes to this idea of placement. So if you put your metrics button on top of the page, it will have a different impact than if you put it on the bottom, because on top of the page, you may get more hit for the page because it will show that, because on the bottom of the page, you will have to wait until the page has completely loaded. So it will kind of give you a different sense of what the metric looks like. So that's one type of transparency with data collection. A second type of transparency is with data design, and that's the area where we really don't know much about, right? How the algorithm works for social media metrics, for example. You know, yesterday the newsfeed guy from is in the room. Oh no, okay. So he said that Google doesn't show their algorithms. So that's something that metrics company cannot manage, cannot know either. So metric company and journalists don't know how the algorithm necessarily work. And there's also the political economy, which is who owns what, the power relationships between that, and for what reason they have built these companies. So these are things that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about metrics. The third type of transparency is this kind of transparency with management, right? So publishers, one of the transparency is often the publisher won't give the information to the advertising company, so that's one of the concern. Another finding is if you are a more traditional news organization that were not online first, it's more likely that the metrics information will be shared with the editors only, and not with the rest of the newsroom. But it turns out that if you are a web-first news organization, they seem much more happier showing the metrics to everybody in the newsroom. So you have like different level of access to metrics here. And also transparency in terms of management, in terms of how social media organization or platform and web analytics company want to share the metrics. And the other thing is that we don't know is how much of the information is actually shared with the audience, because we're collecting all this information with the audience. So a lot of people are wondering in newsroom, so should we actually tell the audience when we're collecting their information, and for what reason should we have that responsibility? So that's what I have for today. Stay tuned, because that's a project that I just started, and now we're going to move from metrics to from web metrics to something that is a little bit more, that's something that we even have less control on. So,
thank you. Well, from my personal metrics, I think that the audience is mostly English speaking, so I will deliver my speech in English. And
last year you delivered
in Italian, yes. I'm jumping to keep half Italian and half English. We will speak about, we will moving a bit more in the future, but maybe it's not the future, it's the present, about the use of robots for journalism. Actually, in my position at the Council of Europe, we are studying very strong the algorithms and the impacts of algorithms on fundamental rights. So, of course, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which covers freedom of expression, and for this reason is usually used to regulate the activity of journalism and speak about journalism, can be put in danger by the use of algorithms and artificial intelligence. And so we need to fix some rules to use these tools in a good way, because the advantages for journalists are, of course, a lot, but to find a way to don't put in danger fundamental rights. So what we intend for robot journalism. Robot journalism is not exactly this. It's not a robot writing the article. Robot journalism at present is much more a software. It's a software that, in a definition given by Dierik, is the practice of using technology to automatically produce news content. So we have a process without the intervention of human. We have a software that is browsing on the internet on a given environment of news, of information, extract the news that he wants to use, and with a data set of library, with a data library, he delivers news. So we don't have any human intervention unless the human want to intervene in this process, for example, for fact-checking or some activity like this. What is the technology that is behind this software? This technology is called natural language generation. And natural language generation is usually one set of science for algorithms and artificial intelligence. So we can have several layers of abstracts about the use of this technology. We have some examples at present. This is how the process works. We have a large amount of information. Of course, the process works better if the information comes from a trusted source. So we have this large amount of information that is processed, and after we have the news delivered and published also, especially on social media or web pages or similar. What example we have? The Los Angeles Times during an interview said that he is using two kind of system of robot journalism. One is QuakeBot. QuakeBot is a system, is a robot that is connected with the United States Geological Survey, and it delivers automatically news about earthquakes. When the earthquake is over a given magnitude, he delivers the news. Of course, you can see that the news is just the magnitude of the earthquake and the zone where the earthquake was. So it's not a complicated news, but what we have with this system? With this system, we have an immediate delivery of the news. There is a gap of around 4 or 5 minutes between the earthquake and the registration, of course, of the US Geological Survey and the publishing of the news. So it's a good system. Another system is about the homicide. I just don't put in the slide because you know, but they have a kind of survey on all the homicides happening in the Los Angeles area. So you have a map with all the dot points on the homicide and the news, because the claim, so to say, of this robot is no homicide without an headline. So you have an headline for every single homicide happening in the Los Angeles area. This is a project, News at 7, that comes from the Intelligent Information Laboratory of the Northwestern University, and is about machine-generated content from existing online sources. So you have more sources than one, like we have seen in QuakeBot. We don't have just one trusted source, but we have several sources. And this software at 7 delivers news chosen by some sources that the programmers are giving. And another one for the fan of football match is Rosalinda, is developed by a Swedish company, and is robot journalism specifically delivered for football match. So it follows all the information about football match, and the aim of this project is to guarantee coverage of the news for the local events. You know, the kind of events that usually are not covered or are covered not when one team win or not. So to guarantee that every football team has a good news coverage. And we are looking through a wide adoption of this system. For example, Press Association made a statement. The editor-in-chief said that the society is going to use more and more kind of automation tools for journalism. And we can see also what are the topics more covered from this kind of journalism. The topics are usually sports, elections. There is one of this system that is running now in France to follow the election of the new French president. Financial news, weather, natural events like the earthquake, as we have seen. So what are the characteristics of this news? It's important to have the news more or less in real time. So it will be very costly for a newsroom to have a journalist following all these small events. The robot can follow all these events and deliver the news immediately. And this is an advantage, of course. So it happens that it seems that we are in the Willy Wonka factory. Everything is good. We have coverage. We can cover also the small events. So everyone is informed. Everyone is happy, and so on. Of course, there is another side. There is the dark side of the use of this technology. But let's focus on the advantage. After, as a good lawyer, I will tell you the problems. But let's start with the advantage. The advantage are the full coverage of the events, the rapidity of delivering of the news, the reduction of the costs, because of course I don't have to put in charge every single journalist on every single topic, the possibility to deliver multi-language news, because for a software it's very easy to deliver the same news in several languages. We have more free time for journalists, so a human journalist, I mean, can follow more another topic without wasting time in following small events. And we have also an help for stop the propagation of false or inaccurate information. One of the main topics of this journalism festival was the fake news. The robot journalism can help, because if you target one news as a fake news, the robot will not spread this news anymore. And so you have a good effect on this topic. But we have also problem. This is a page that I took from USA Today, I think. And it's about a mistake the QuakeBot does last 30th of May, reporting an earthquake of magnitude 5.1 that never happened. So we must conclude that robots can be wrong. So the Willy Wonka factory is still changing, is already changing. What can we do to make the robots more reliable? The input must come from trusted source. We have also a standardization of the news due to the use of the same library. So if you look at the QuakeBot news, they are more or less the same. What changes is just the magnitude and the location of the earthquake. And there is a general cost of this system, because these systems are not inexpensive. So the problems that I see are, the first, about security. We are now looking on the rising of security problem for the Internet of Things. In my opinion, we have to look also for the problem of security connected with algorithms and artificial intelligence in all their possible use, so also for journalism. What can we do to try to fix the security issues? Create a list of trusted sources, make a control of the data library, cross-check verification of the news, of course. The robot can do the cross-check verification. So for example, taking the QuakeBot example, if he has another source that was not just the US Geological Survey, he can check that the earthquake was not reported by the other source, so he can at least raise the flag and say, wait, I have to check if this earthquake already really happen or not. Security audit of the code and random human verification, so kind of audit process. And another concern, this is a concern that we are actually dealing with at the Council of Europe, is a concern about ethics. It's difficult to speak about ethics thinking of algorithm and artificial intelligence. We have to think that this, the programmers of this system must take into account the ethical dimension governing journalism, because we are speaking about robots used for journalism, but in a general sense, when programmers are dealing with this kind of software, they have to consider the ethical implication of the specific field where this software will be applied. And some consideration, besides the code of ethics for human journalists, are about transparency of these algorithms, accountability of the programmers of these algorithms, the input of an ethical framework inside the algorithms, and some techniques of risk assessment. Another point that is difficult, and the European Union now is dealing with this, the European Parliament has just issued an interesting study about the liability of automated system in a general sense. The European Parliament concluded that, in principle, once the parties bearing the ultimate responsibility have been identified, their liability should be proportional to the actual level of instruction given to the robot and of its degree of autonomy, so that the greater the robot learning capability or autonomy and the longer a robot training, the greater the responsibility of its trainer should be. So the more you are going to train a system with kind of back propagation techniques to see if the system is really gathering the good news, is delivering the good news, and so on, the more you are responsible for bad training, so to say, of the software. And so the European Federation was aware of this problem, and in March, so just 1 month ago, they had a general meeting considering the implication of the use of robot journalism in the professional, and this is the recipe to have a good implementation of robot journalism. First, the training for journalists on how to use automated content and data journalism, and project management used in computational field. Dialogue between journalists, editors, and computers and data scientists, because of course we have to tell to the programmers what are the ethical standards that we want are implemented into the software. Transparency, including the use of the algorithm, so how the algorithm works, and apply journalist ethical standard to automated content and algorithms. The suggestions, I totally agree with, of the European Federation of Journalists. We are moving forward, so probably we will see in the future a robot winning the Pulitzer Prize. It's not impossible. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again, everyone, for being here. And I think my talk should follow along quite nicely in terms of the risks and potential liabilities that exist with automated forms of journalism. My hope is just to simply raise some questions and some provocations, things we should be thinking about with regard to the implementation of automated forms of journalism and what types of potential potential liabilities, particularly in the case of libel, may exist. And just as a note, again, I'm Seth Lewis from the University of Oregon, and this work that I'll present to you has been some research I've done with a media law student at the University of Minnesota, Casey Carmody. So I want to start with a quick little story that I think puts this in context. Last August, you may recall there was some controversy over the summer of 2016 with regard to Facebook and how it managed its trending topics feature on the right, the right-hand side of the page, you would see a list of news stories or little issues that Facebook identified as being hot topics, things that people were talking about. And there had been some controversy with regard to whether Facebook was downplaying conservative issues and giving more credence to liberal causes or articles and so forth. And so what Facebook did is it actually removed its human editors from managing the trending topics, and instead had algorithms handle that process. And so within literally hours of this change occurring, there was a particularly sticky problem, as you can see here from this BuzzFeed article by Craig Silverman, who is here at IJF and has been talking quite a bit about fake news and is a key expert in this area. He recognized that Facebook made a particularly sketchy website's fake story a trending topic for much of the day and into the next day as well. Fox News host Megyn Kelly was one of the top trending topics on Facebook. Her name appeared on the sidebar screen seen by users in the United States. And what happened is if you hovered over that name, over that topic, up popped this story that claimed that this Fox News host had been kicked out, had lost her job for backing Hillary Clinton for president, which is something that never happened. So it's a false story on a false site, but nevertheless was one of the most shared and trending topics. And so when Facebook recognized the issue, of course, they took it down, but it raised the question, could a bot commit libel? Well, for reasons that will become clear in this presentation, Megyn Kelly certainly could not have successfully sued Facebook over the situation. But you might imagine, we can imagine other scenarios in which a private individual, not of that sort of stature in the public sphere, could somehow be tied up into some kind of association that's very negative, that harms their reputation, and therefore could raise the question that if the robot goes off the rails, so to speak, who is going to be responsible in that situation? So 4 essential points I'd like to make today. One is that automated journalism, as Pierluigi just talked about, is a growing feature of algorithmic news and likely will continue to improve and proliferate in the years ahead. News organizations that are adopting such algorithms may need to consider, in addition to the social, technical, and ethical questions that Pierluigi described so well, they may need to also consider some legal implications of libel that could be committed by a news writing algorithm, however far-fetched that may sound at this point in time. And a crucial point here is that I'll be talking about the US media law situation, which obviously is particular to the US, but because the U.S. provides some of the most generous defenses against libel claims, I think this makes it all the more interesting now for us to consider what these possibilities may be for newsrooms outside the U.S. The crucial point here is that because news companies may not be as safe as they assume, particularly when it comes to potential libel regarding private individuals rather than public figures. Let's see, why is this? Okay, sorry, came up a little oddly. So as Pierluigi pointed out just a moment ago, when we talk about automated journalism, often we have this sort of image. Often in news coverage, it includes images of a robot reporter working at a typewriter, oddly enough. And so, I think we're trying to get our heads around what exactly, how do we visualize, how do we understand this phenomenon? And it's obviously not robots, we're just talking about software. But for some reason, we don't like to call it software-produced journalism. But I think it is helpful just to recognize that these are pieces of software that produce news in an automated fashion. Another definition to add to the one that was shared a moment ago is algorithmic processes that convert structured data into narrative news texts with little to no human intervention beyond the initial programming. So when we look at the history of new technologies and free speech protections in US law, a few things become apparent. One is that as new technologies emerge, and this is radio, television, new broadcast technologies, et cetera, the history suggests that there are questions, there's a period of time of sort of figuring out whether such technologies represent truly new forms of speech, and therefore should they receive protection according to the First Amendment and its free speech protections there. So algorithms in particular pose a tricky kind of case because the law has not yet to settle the question of whether they are common carriers like the telephone, whether they're merely conduits of other people's speech, or whether they're in fact more like newspapers. They're creators of speech. So there is no clear consensus, but what is beginning to emerge is that we may never be able to untangle these two. That in certain cases, as one observer pointed out, it will soon become more difficult to unbundle technology speech rights from our own. So where do human speech rights and machine speech rights, as it were, begin? That may never quite be determined. So in the question of libel here, just as a brief definition, it's defined as the false publication of fact about a person that injures his or her reputation in the eyes of the community or deters others from associating with him or her. So the key points there are falsity of something that is presumed to be factual in nature and that, of course, causes serious harm to reputation. So what happens if and when libel occurs through automated journalism? The three key areas that I want to touch on briefly. One is that we will talk about this issue of requiring plaintiffs to prove actual malice, and then I'll talk about some issues with regard to what I call the Google defense, or claiming to be simply a hands-off provider and therefore not responsible for the content. And finally, a third area is the issue of opinion. Could a claim be made that it was simply opinion and not fact, and therefore not, doesn't fall into the definition of libel? So with regard to the first point, in U.S. media law, and again, this is a little more particular to the U.S., but in the last 50 years, cases have established that for a plaintiff to win a libel lawsuit, if they are a public figure, that is a government official, a celebrity, or someone who has a high status or high position in terms of visibility within the public sphere, public figures must prove actual malice. That is, they must demonstrate that the defendant, usually the news organization, knew that what they were publishing was false, and they did so recklessly, right? They acted with reckless intent in publishing that material. But private individuals, which would be many of us in this room and others who don't have that kind of public face, need only prove negligence. That is, there's a much lower bar. They only need to show that the organization acted with, that it failed to act with reasonable care. So the upshot here is that if a libel case occurs that involving a public figure, usually if this happens with humans writing the story, then there's a process involved. There may be depositions, there may be ways of interviewing and finding out what were the processes that were involved. Did the news organization fact check the material? Did they talk to sources? Did they give people a chance to respond, et cetera? Well, we can't really do that with an algorithm. You can't really interview the automated system. So it would be virtually impossible to sort of untangle actual malice in that case. But when it comes to a private individual, because that bar is much lower, it is possible, if data are not properly cleaned, if they're not handled with care, and I think this gets to some of the issues that Pierluigi raised with regard to, if certain processes to ensure good data, good material, and so on are not followed, then at least there's the potential that an organization could be accused of failing to exercise reasonable care. The second area where a news organization might claim a defense is to say, and I'm calling this myself the Google defense. Essentially, they're saying, we're not responsible. We're merely a conduit of speech. So the analogous case here for journalists is the lawsuits that have been made against Google for its autocomplete search results. So if you were to go to Google and you start to type in a set of terms, you've probably seen this before where it recommends certain search terms. Well, this one up here, the visual you have before you is kind of a particularly controversial case from 2012 where the former First Lady of Germany sued Google, brought action against them because of the associations with her name in autocomplete search results, which she said were entirely baseless and were just based on rumors. And so this is an illustration of how Google's claim was, hey, we're simply connecting people who are searching with pages that offer information about that. We are not responsible for the content they're in. In this case, actually, they did back down because of a cease and desist order. In the news organization's case, though, it would be hard to make that case that they're simply a conduit of information because whereas in US media law, there's a distinction between interactive content providers, which have no responsibility, and information content providers. So, interactive computer providers and information content providers. The one being a platform, the other being a producer. And so journalists, news organizations would fall into the latter category. And so there'd be no real relying here on the Google defense in this case. And then the third area is that this question of opinion. The courts they've carved out special protections for opinions, satire, ideas that can't be proven factually, and so on. Well, so in this case, statements of pure opinion rather than statements of facts are immune from libel litigation. It would be very hard for journalists to demonstrate this in the case of automated journalism, however, because journalism is presumed to be about facts, right? This is what we've been hearing about for the last several days at this conference, is all of the concern over fake news and so on. There's a sense that journalists provide just the facts. Moreover, it doesn't help that many of these automated journalistic systems are themselves framed in very objective sorts of terms, that somehow the algorithms help us to achieve a more neutral, balanced set of perspectives, which would be the opposite of something that's saying it's purely opinion. So a few points here on which to conclude. As automated journalism grows, we are going to need to make sense not only of its social, ethical, and technical dimensions, but also its legal implications for organizations. And I would agree in many ways that libel by algorithm may seem ridiculous at this point, but also the very notion of automated journalism itself probably seemed fairly ridiculous a decade ago. And so it's probably better to begin asking questions and trying to come up with some solutions before it becomes a problem. Just to reiterate again, at least within the US media law context, and we could talk about how that may differ elsewhere, if public figures are defamed by bots, there's much less of a concern. But if, depending on how the data is used and so on, a private figure were to be involved, then it could be a bigger issue. And so I think this gets back to a question that Pierluigi raised, which is that when these things go awry, who bears ultimate responsibility? And that will yet to be determined. Thank you.
Thank each of the speakers for their thoughtful remarks and for their attention to our time constraints. I think I'd like to open the floor very shortly, so feel free to start jotting down questions you'd like to ask. To get the discussion started, I'll ask each of our speakers to answer what we might call the Rumsfeld question. We've spoken a lot about things that we know, and things that we know we don't know. I wonder if each of the speakers could tell us a bit about some of the things that we don't know that we know, and some of the things that we don't know that we don't know. And if you can link it back to journalism norms and practices, that would be really helpful.
That's my area of expertise. No, I'll start. Actually, I kind of knew what Colin was going to ask. So I think that's kind of something when I was listening to all just to tie the conversations together was this idea of data and what we do with the data. So I guess like one of the things that I would say that we really don't know would be that what do these companies that have that data do with that data outside of the practices and the norms of journalism? So, and how does the use of this data varies across these companies that are not journalistic companies, or how does the use of this data varies within, across the journalistic companies as well. And there are similar concerns when we talk about liability, right? So whose responsibility it is to deal with this data. And also, I think one of the kind of important question, which is more kind of a broad academic question that I would like to ask as well, and maybe for journalists to try to answer, is that what does that data do to the world that we all live in as human beings, but also the world that journalists are kind of creating and doing this and producing news to the world, so the news that everybody is going to consume. So does that create a different type of world that we knew before, that we had before we had this data? It's just like a broad question to ask that ties into the kind of ethical concerns here.
So what I would add to that is that perhaps the thing we didn't touch on here, and so getting into this realm of what perhaps we know we don't know, or maybe we don't know, is that we've talked primarily about ways in which news organizations receive data, whether from the audience generating it by their visits to the site or their apps, or by using third-party data around finance or sports or other means, and then transforming that into narrative text. And in some ways, you could look at what would be the potential outcome of combining those two, right? So where you actually have automated stories that attend to personalized interests. In other words, the behaviors of audiences in visiting sites and apps and so on end up shaping the types of stories produced through automated means. So such that you could have not just one story that represents a particular sporting event, but rather multiple stories tailored to the individual who's come to that site. And in that scenario, we can imagine all kinds of potential privacy data privacy and other issues that could arise in dealing with that combination of both the personalization and the automation of these processes. So I think that's the kind of frontier we have yet to get to, and there'll be some issues to untangle with that.
Well, from my point of view, what I know that I don't know is the logic that is based on which is based the algorithms. And this is important. I don't know if the programmer, for example, is placing his bias inside the algorithms. And this can have a great impact talking about news. But what I don't know, if they don't know, is how the algorithms really works. We have some example of algorithms originally developed for, especially for, we have some question on employment law, so used for progress of career and this kind of analysis that had some bias inside. So for example, they advantage some class of workers and not others. But this was not an instruction given by the programmer. This is how the algorithms starts working, maybe for the data set, maybe for another input. So it's important to provide always a human supervision on how the algorithms works and provide the training, even if the training is one of the elements for liability.
It's a great time to open things up to the floor. And who'd like to continue the conversation? Ask any or all of our panelists a question, or provide some thoughts from your own organization's perspective. Yes. We have mics that will arrive there.
Thank you all. It's been fascinating. I just really wanted to ask about regulation, because you talked about algorithms and bots in terms of how things can be automated and the potential for problems to occur through that automated process. But what if policymakers want to get involved in helping this process? We've seen instances of this already, and those instances have been problematic. So is there anything that the panel thinks, any of you think, that could be done from a policy-making perspective that could make this any easier?
Well, from my European point of view, it's very easy to answer, because the European Union is thinking about creating an agency for robots that at the beginning must set the principle for liability of automated system in a broader sense. And after, we will see in the future development of this agency, but they can intervene in the practical training and practical audit of automated system. So the policymakers are acting on a general overview of all the automated system. Of course, the most attention now is about medical device using algorithms and artificial intelligence and self-driving vehicles.
So what I would add to that is that from the US context, we don't have as much to add regarding regulation because it doesn't happen as readily. However, I think, so one example, you might be interested in Cathy O'Neill's new book, Weapons of Math Destruction. It's a book that I think nicely outlines some of the challenges and pitfalls with algorithms and the need for regulating them, but also the difficulty in doing so in a meaningful way. But I think the thing I would add to this is that automated journalism as an issue, as a problem, as a thing to be solved in some ways from a regulatory standpoint is relatively, really a small one in comparison to the much bigger issues. So we have problems of algorithms, affecting job applicants and their ability to have their resumes surface, or issues of fair housing, or other, financial and kind of major issues in the U.S. that probably rise much higher on the scale than issues of kind of robot journalism at this point. But certainly I think there is kind of a broad question to be asked about, again, from a responsibility standpoint, what types of ethics, intentions, assumptions, what types of issues need to be addressed both at the programming side of things as well as from the user's perspective. What type of knowledge are we expecting users to have, and how does that, what kind of learning needs to take place both on the production side and on the reception side?
I think you've summarized it quite well.
I'm curious what news organizations you guys are seeing that you think are engaging actively and effectively with some of these questions and problems. I mean, we know, for example, that Reuters has played around with using news algorithms to produce financial stories. I used to work at Bloomberg. I'm sure they're doing that too, although I haven't seen any news about that. This question that you raise about personalization of news, I mean, that's already a factor in the marketing world, in the content marketing world. Everybody talks about, oh, let's not creep people out by letting them know how much we know about them when they come online and we interact with them. So the news industry can get there as well, and that is, I think, a really important set of questions for us to be talking about. So who in the news industry is engaging with those questions now?
So first, with regard to automated journalism, the Associated Press has been kind of probably the most active news organization in the U.S. at this point in experimenting with and just deploying various systems for automation. They have been producing automated stories on quarterly financial earnings reports for publicly traded companies. I think they produce maybe 3,000 to 5,000 each quarter. And they've been doing that now for the last several years. And I will add that I think they've done so in a rather careful way, and they've been somewhat transparent, really, in sort of talking about what they're doing and giving examples and trying to make it apparent. And actually, just this week, the AP and some folks at the AP produced a report about the future of AI and smart machines in the context of journalism. So they're certainly thinking about what the frontiers of this area look like, and I think doing so in a fairly responsible way. But to your point, yes, that the AP is not going to be producing personalized stories because they're not so much interacting with audience data, with those metrics, right? They're producing news articles that then disperse around the web or go to their various partner organizations. It's when we talk about personalization, I mean, clearly in the realm of Facebook and other social media sites, there's a high degree of personalization, but yet probably not really a high degree of automated content production. And so it's where those two meet is going to be, I think, interesting. But certainly there are a number of news organizations that have tried to be a little more forward-thinking with regard to metrics. And I think NPR and its CareBot is a good example that Valerie described of trying to get beyond the page view as a metric, but to think about other metrics that may indicate a degree of loyalty and a degree of success of a story or of an initiative that goes beyond just simply some of the, right now we've been using metrics that tend to drive perverse incentives, right? They tend to give news organizations, and it pushes them toward clickbait and so on. We want to push against that. I think there's ways to find new metrics.
And also, I think one of the tension that I've noticed is that the organizations that will be more open, so yes, you have NPR in terms of metrics, but it will also be the ones that are normally online first. So these organizations would tend to share the information more with their journalists. Then the next step would be, should they share this information with their audience as well? So, and I think part of it is that there's a lot of kind of unknown about where that data comes from in these questions of transparency, and especially with regards with social media metrics, for example, where we don't really know anything about the algorithms. We kind of know the general values of Facebook, but we don't really know anything about the actual algorithms. So that to create transparency with that, it goes beyond the level of the news organization and goes beyond the level of the metrics web analytics company. So there are like kind of different types of metrics that are more easily shareable. It varies across different types of organization, and but there are other ones that we still don't really know, and it is what and maybe the journalists should like push a little bit more these kind of platforms. I think they're doing a great job here at IGF, but to push more these organizations to show their information too.
From the point of view of the international organization like the Council of Europe, there is a constant exchange with the private parties, so with the media actors, to keep them aware about the ethical implication and the possible problems, the possible issues of using these tools. And yeah, I think that there are some kind of training program to keep the attention on this, and also the international organization is claiming for transparency. Transparency in a both sense. From one point of view, the audience must be informed that the news that is reading is generated by a machine. So no fake names, so to say, signing the article or delivering the article. From the other point of view, of course, transparency about the process, where the news are taken, how they are processed, how the news is delivered, is there a timing, is there other elements that are taken into account to select when the news is delivered.
Well, that takes us just about to time, so I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the staff and volunteers for making this event happen and making it such a special gathering over the past few days. Thank you to those in the room, in the audience, and those who've tuned in to the webcast online. Thanks also to the speakers for coming very long distances in some cases to be here. We'll be very happy to linger outside as they do the changeover, answer any questions you have. But thanks so much, and looking forward to continuing the discussion.
About more specifically is how the relationship between journalists and web metrics companies and how they're dealing with issues of transparency. But before I start, I want to give a little bit of information about myself. So why am I studying metrics, where I come from? I'm a media sociologist, and my interest of studies is how new technologies is changing the culture of journalism. I studied how social media has changed journalism in some case studies, like the BBC. With Colin, we've done some work on mobile chat applications, and now my new project is on metrics. So how many of you here use metrics in newsrooms? Okay. Are you an editor, or what's your role? Yeah. So you use metrics on a daily basis?
Not on a daily basis. For me, it's rather doing strategies for editors and tell them what could be a relevant path to follow to increase their audience. And I'm also using it for search engine optimization purposes, which is not even on a daily basis, but where your audience comes from and where it goes to. That's what my focus.
That's interesting. So I should talk to you after that. So and just another example, how do you use metrics?
So I've used metrics both as an editor in a newsroom to see what stories are performing the best in terms of traffic and give feedback to reporters on what practices work best and which stories performed well and why we think that might be. I've also worked in content marketing at a big corporation and used metrics there to see, again, what articles are performing well and why, and also as part of a search engine optimization strategy.
And do you find there differences between the journalism and the strategic communication field?
I find that there's a much stronger appetite for the use of metrics within the content marketing realm than in journalism.
Okay, interesting. So there's a few, and who has never used metrics or thought about it ever? Don't be shy. I was there once. Okay, so I'll kind of go over, so thank you for your comments. I'll go over some of kind of the basics of metrics, right? So sorry for the people who actually use it on an everyday basis in their newsroom. Oh, right. They can make in the newsroom, so where they would put the story and that will get more clicks, for example. Another thing is metrics is allowing journalists to finally kind of have an idea of what their audience is, right? When we're talking about metrics, for example, to know where people come from. So now we finally know where people come from when they read their news. It's also a way for engaging with audience. This is like a little bit of a buzzword in a sense that, you know, like engagement, not in terms of the audience being completely engaged in the information that you're providing, but maybe more in terms of time spent reading an article or amount of people reading an article online. And there are challenges, right? Because at the same time that you see an increasing amount of people using metrics in newsroom, there's what scholar have found out is that a lot of journalists tends to be a little bit more dismissive. So because it kind of is a challenge between how do I keep my autonomy as a news producer, but how do I also take into account what the audience likes? So here's a few examples of how news organizations have used.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to this panel that will discuss metrics and algorithms in journalism. Very pleased that all of you have decided to join us on this glorious afternoon here in Perugia. There are many places you could be right now, out in the sun, enjoying a terrace, and we're very glad that you decided to join us here for what I hope will be a productive and stimulating discussion. This will be it's a group of academics, but we're friendly academics, and we're academics who are very keen to discuss practice and real-world things and case studies. And so I encourage you to ask any of the panelists questions about things very close to the ground, close to your organizations, things that affect the way you produce and distribute the news. What I'll do, my name is Colin Egger, I'll be the chair for this. I'll introduce each of the colleagues, and then I will hand things over to Valerie, who will get us started. To my immediate right is Seth Lewis, who is a professor of journalism at Oregon State University. Next is Pierluigi Peri, who is a professor of law at the University of Milan, and who is at the moment in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe. And at the far side is Valerie Belair-Gagnon, who is a professor of journalism studies at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. So with that, I will pass things over to Valerie, who will begin by talking about measuring success with metrics.
So welcome. Thank you so much for inviting us here again in Perugia. So today what I will so again, there are like different types of metrics in newsroom. We have audience metrics, so you can look at how many visitors come to your page views, how many people, how much time people spend on your page, how do they scroll down your page. There are also information that you can get on the audience, so you can get location where the audience comes from or some information about demographics. So you can kind of like even like point down to the city level where in the city the person is watching or reading your news online. And there are also kind of audience metric that you can get on different devices, so that will vary on mobile, on the web, etc. And also, I mentioned there's like, you can measure content, right? So how many % of people exit your page, and when do they decide to exit your page? So all of this is very interesting because we have a lot of data, and what we're asking ourselves right now is what do we do with that data, and what does it mean for journalism? So scholars, lots of friendly scholars studying this in newsrooms, including, I think Seth has studies at also metrics. Lots of what scholars have found out is that most of the people are using metrics to inform their decision making. So when do they choose? Oh, yeah, I'm just managing two computers. So what kind of decisions